The North Atlantic, 300 miles west of the Bay of Biscay. The date was June 9, 1942. The time was 23:45 hours. Aboard U-boat 502. Oberleutnant Jürgen von Rosenstiel stood in the conning tower, breathing night air that tasted of salt and diesel fumes. Above him, stars pierced a moonless sky. Around him, the ocean rolled in long, gentle swells that caught no light. It was the kind of darkness submariners called velvet black, the kind that made a surfaced U-boat nearly invisible. Below his feet, in the cramped control room, the chief engineer was monitoring the battery charge. The boat had been submerged for 16 hours, stalking a convoy that had ultimately eluded them. Now the batteries were depleted to 30% capacity. They needed to surface, they needed to run the diesels, they needed to drink in electric power for another day of hunting. This was the rhythm of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Dive at dawn, hunt submerged through daylight hours, surface after dark to charge and breathe. For 2 years, this rhythm had given German U-boats mastery of the night sea. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force owned the daylight, but darkness belonged to the wolf packs. Von Rosenstiel had made this calculation 100 times. British aircraft could not see in the dark. Their radar was primitive, unreliable. A U-boat on the surface at night was safe. The statistics proved it. In all of 1941, Coastal Command had sunk exactly 2 U-boats at night. 2 out of hundreds of patrols. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The diesel engines coughed to life, their familiar hammer breaking the silence. Von Rosenstiel felt the vibration through the deck plating. In the engine room, mechanics would be checking temperatures, pressures, fuel flow. On the hull behind him, an electrician's mate was connecting the charging cables. Everything routine, everything safe. The lookouts scanned their sectors with binoculars. North, east, south, west. Empty horizon in every direction. The chief reported battery charge beginning, voltage climbing, all systems normal. Von Rosenstiel allowed himself to relax slightly. In 4 hours, maybe 5, they would have enough charge to submerge again at dawn. Then they would continue their patrol, searching for the merchant convoys that carried fuel, food, and ammunition to Britain. This was their purpose, to strangle the island, to make Churchill's fortress uninhabitable. Every tanker sunk, every freighter sent to the bottom, brought Germany closer to victory. He thought about his crew, 44 men living in a steel tube 100 meters long and 6 meters wide. They had been at sea for 21 days. They had sunk 2 merchants, damaged a 3rd. Morale was good. Rations were holding, the air recyclers were functioning. In another week, they would return to Lorient or Saint-Nazaire to fresh food, hot showers, and the adulation that greeted successful boat commanders. The night remained perfectly dark, perfectly still, perfectly safe, or so he believed. What Oberleutnant von Rosenstiel did not know, what no U-boat commander yet understood, was that the rules had changed. Somewhere in the darkness above, an aircraft was approaching. A Wellington bomber of No. 172 Squadron, Royal Air Force Coastal Command. In its belly, a weapon that would transform night into day, a technology that would end the U-boat's sanctuary in darkness and shift the balance of the Atlantic War. The aircraft was 4 miles away, then 3, then 2, still invisible, still silent, still closing. In 90 seconds, von Rosenstiel's world would explode in light. To understand what happened that night west of Biscay, one must first understand what a U-boat was, how it operated, and why darkness had become its shield. The Type 7 U-boat, the most common variant in German service, was a machine of contradictions. On the surface, it could make 17 knots, powered by twin diesel engines generating 3,200 horsepower. Submerged, running on batteries, it managed barely 7 knots for 1 hour before those batteries demanded recharging. This fundamental limitation shaped everything. A U-boat was not truly a submarine in the modern sense. It was a submersible torpedo boat. It spent most of its operational time on the surface, diving only to attack, to evade, or to hide during daylight. The interior was a study in compressed humanity. 50 men shared space with torpedoes, provisions, fuel, and machinery. The forward torpedo room doubled as crew quarters. Men slept in bunks, stacked 3 high between the weapons. The single toilet forward often served as food storage until supplies diminished enough to make it usable. The air inside grew thick with moisture, diesel vapor, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of battery acid. Bread molded within days. Condensation dripped constantly from the hull. Men wore the same clothing for weeks, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat. Fresh water was rationed to half a litre per man per day for all purposes. Cooking, drinking, washing, most chose drinking. The psychological toll was immense. Claustrophobia, constant vigilance, the knowledge that one depth charge, one torpedo, one collision could send them to the bottom with no chance of escape. And yet, they were winning. In 1940, U-boats had sunk over 1,000 Allied merchant ships. In 1941, the number exceeded another 1,000. The tonnage lost was staggering. 4 million tons of shipping in 41 alone. Britain was being slowly strangled. Convoys helped, but the Atlantic was vast, and U-boats were multiplying. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, believed he needed only to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. The mathematics would do the rest. The key to this success was the surface attack at night. U-boats would track convoys by day from periscope depth, then surface after dark to attack from within the convoy itself. Their low profile made them invisible. Their diesel engines gave them speed to maneuver. Their deck guns could finish off damaged ships without wasting torpedoes. The British had tried everything to counter this. More escorts, better training, improved sonar. But sonar only worked underwater. Radar existed, but early models were crude, their range limited, their returns unreliable. Aircraft carried depth charges, but finding a U-boat in the vast darkness of the Atlantic was like finding a pebble in a coal mine. So U-boat commanders surfaced with confidence. They charged their batteries in the open air. They made good speed on the surface, covering hundreds of miles between patrol zones. They breathed, they smoked, they felt almost safe. The statistics supported their confidence. Through all of 1941, Coastal Command flew thousands of night patrols and achieved almost nothing. The darkness was complete. The U-boats were ghosts. This belief, this operational doctrine, this sense of nocturnal invulnerability had become fundamental to U-boat tactics. Commanders like von Rosenstiel had internalized it. They surfaced at night not with trepidation but with relief. The night was their friend, their sanctuary, their hunting ground. But in the spring of 1942, a group of scientists and engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough had been working on a problem. How do you illuminate a target at night without warning it first? How do you turn darkness into day in an instant, giving your aircraft just enough time to attack before the U-boat can dive? The answer was called the Leigh Light, named after squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Leigh, the officer who had championed its development. It was brutally simple, a naval searchlight producing 24 million candlepower mounted under the fuselage of an aircraft. Coupled with improved centimetric radar that could detect a surfaced U-boat at several miles, the system worked like this. Radar finds the target in darkness, aircraft homes in silently. Then, at the last moment, the light ignites, turning night into noon, giving the pilot perhaps 20 seconds to line up and drop depth charges before the U-boat can crash dive to safety. Number 1, 7-2. Squadron had begun operations with Leigh Lights in early June 1942. Von Rosenstiel and his crew were about to become students in a very short, very brutal lesson. The education of a U-boat commander began long before he ever put to sea. It started in the submarine school at Neustadt, where officers learned the technical systems, the tactics, the traditions. They studied the successes of the aces, Gunther Prien, who had penetrated Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship Royal Oak, Otto Kretschmer, who had perfected the night surface attack, Wolfgang Luth, whose patrols in distant waters had made him a legend. These men were heroes of the Reich, their faces on recruiting posters, their tactics taught as doctrine. The message was clear. The U-boat was Germany's most potent weapon. In the U-boat arm, individual initiative was prized. Commanders operated with unusual independence. They hunted alone or in loose coordination. They made their own tactical decisions. Success brought recognition, promotion, and the respect of peers. The Knight's Cross with oak leaves was the dream of every commander. More than that, U-boat men believed they were winning the war. While the Wehrmacht struggled in Russia, while the Luftwaffe lost aircraft over Britain, the U-boats were strangling the enemy's supply lines. Every patrol that returned with kills was celebrated. Every tonnage report showed Allied losses mounting. The boats themselves inspired a strange affection among their crews. Each had a personality, quirks in handling, sounds that were unique. Men spoke of their boat as a living thing. She rolled gently or heavily. She dove quickly or reluctantly. She was lucky or cursed. This anthropomorphization was a psychological defense against the reality of living inside a machine designed to sink. If the boat had a spirit, perhaps it would protect them. Superstitions abounded. Don't whistle below decks, don't mention certain words, touch the mascot before diving. These rituals gave men a sense of control in an environment where control was largely illusory. The operational pattern had become routine by mid-1942. Boats would depart their bases on the French coast, usually Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, or La Rochelle. These bases, built with massive concrete pens to protect submarines from bombing, were fortresses. U-boats could be serviced, repaired, and reprovisioned in safety. From there, they would transit through the Bay of Biscay, a journey of about 2 days, before reaching the open Atlantic hunting grounds. The transit was the most dangerous phase for German submarines. The bay was relatively shallow, well patrolled by British aircraft, and offered few places to hide. Standard doctrine called for submerged transit during daylight, surfacing only at night. Once in the Atlantic proper, boats would spread out along convoy routes. Intelligence from B-Dienst, the German naval cryptographic service, often provided information about convoy schedules and routes. U-boats would position themselves, wait, then strike. The night surface attack had evolved into an art. Commanders would approach from the dark side of the convoy, using the merchant ship's own silhouettes against the sky to aim. They would fire torpedoes from close range, sometimes inside the escort screen, then slip away in the confusion. If spotted, they could dive in 30 to 40 seconds, disappearing before escorts could prosecute. Battery management was the constant concern. A Type 7 carried 2 large lead-acid battery banks, one forward, one aft, together containing 124 cells. When fully charged, they provided power for about 20 hours at slow speed submerged, or 1 hour at full speed. But they could not be recharged underwater. The diesels required air, vast quantities of it. So every night, weather permitting, U-boats surfaced. The diesels would run, powering both the propellers and the electric generators that recharged the batteries. A full charge took 4 to 6 hours, depending on how depleted the batteries were. During this charging period, the U-boat was vulnerable in theory, but safe in practice. British patrol aircraft flew at night, yes, but finding a U-boat in the dark Atlantic was nearly impossible. Early radar could sometimes detect a surfaced boat, but the returns were inconsistent, easily lost in sea clutter. Visual sighting required moonlight and luck. Commanders knew the moon phases, avoided full moons when possible, but even moonlit nights offered concealment. A U-boat's conning tower rose only about 6 feet above the waterline. From an aircraft at 1,000 feet altitude, spotting such a small dark object against dark water was extraordinarily difficult, so the belief had hardened into certainty. Night equals safety. Surface at night. Charge in the open. The numbers proved it. In the first 5 months of 1942, before the Leigh Light, Coastal Command had sunk perhaps 3 or 4 U-boats at night, out of hundreds at sea. The odds were overwhelming in the submarine's favour. This statistical reality shaped behaviour. Commanders surfaced with confidence. Lookouts scanned for surface threats, destroyers or corvettes, not aircraft. The bridge crew would smoke, grateful for fresh air after hours in the fetid interior. Officers would take star sights for navigation. Engineers would check the diesels. Electricians would monitor the charge. Everything routine. Everything safe. Everything predictable. Until it was not. The man who would change the nature of submarine warfare was not a famous admiral or brilliant scientist. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Lee was an operations officer with a practical mind and a persistent nature. In 1940, while serving with Coastal Command, he had become frustrated by the inability of aircraft to attack U-boats at night. The mathematics were brutal. A surfaced U-boat needed 30 to 40 seconds to crash dive to safety. An aircraft needed visual contact to line up an attack run. But in darkness, by the time a pilot saw a U-boat, the submarine had already seen or heard the aircraft and was diving. The window of opportunity closed before it opened. Leigh proposed a solution. Mount a powerful searchlight on the aircraft. Use the primitive radar to guide the approach in darkness. Then, at the last moment, illuminate the target. The light would blind the U-boat lookouts, eliminate their dive time advantage, and give the pilot just enough seconds to attack. The concept was simple. The execution proved difficult. The searchlight had to be powerful enough to illuminate a target from altitude. It had to be directional, not washing out the pilot's own night vision. It had to be rugged enough to withstand aircraft vibration and mounted, so it could be aimed independently of the aircraft's flight path. The engineers at Farnborough worked through 1941 to solve these problems. They selected a naval searchlight used on destroyers, producing 24 million candle power. The light was mounted in a retractable housing under the aircraft's belly, angled slightly downward. A crude but effective aiming mechanism allowed the operator to adjust it. The power supply came from the aircraft's generators, supplemented by batteries. The entire system weighed over 700 pounds, reducing the aircraft's payload. Early tests were promising but revealed problems. The light's heat was tremendous. It could only operate for 90 seconds before overheating. The glare affected the pilot's vision despite baffles and shielding. The radar guidance was imprecise. Operators struggled to translate a radar contact into the correct bearing for the light. But by early 1942, most issues had been resolved. The weapon system consisted of 3 components working in sequence. First, the ASV Mark II radar, operating on 1.5-meter wavelength. This radar could detect a surfaced U-boat at about 7 to 10 miles, depending on sea conditions. The operator would guide the pilot toward the contact, calling out bearings and ranges. Second, as the aircraft closed to about 1 mile, the pilot would begin a descent to attack altitude, typically 400 to 800 feet. The radar operator would continue calling corrections. Third, at a range of 800 to 1,000 yards, roughly half a mile, the searchlight would be switched on. The light beam, focused to about 15 degrees spread, would illuminate an area about 800 feet in diameter at that range, small enough to spotlight a U-boat precisely, wide enough to account for minor aiming errors. The pilot now had 15 to 20 seconds. In that time, he had to confirm the target was hostile, adjust his approach, steady the aircraft, and release depth charges at the optimal position. The charges were set to detonate at 25 feet depth, the sweet spot for a U-boat caught on the surface. If the submarine was beginning to dive, its conning tower would be approximately at that depth when the charges exploded. The system demanded split-second timing and perfect coordination between pilot, radar operator, and light operator. One mistake and the U-boat would escape. No. 172 Squadron received the first operational Leigh Light aircraft in May 1942. They flew Wellington bombers, twin-engine aircraft with good endurance and payload capacity. The squadron was based at Chivanor in North Devon, positioned to patrol the western approaches and the Bay of Biscay. The crews trained intensively, simulated attacks against surfaced submarines, practice with the lights, coordination drills. The learning curve was steep. Pilots had to maintain precise altitude and airspeed during the approach. Too high and the depth charges would miss. Too low, and they risked being caught in their own explosions. Radar operators had to filter genuine contacts from false returns caused by waves. Light operators had to time the illumination perfectly. By early June, the squadron was ready. The first operational patrols began on June 4, 1942. For the first few nights they found nothing. The Atlantic was vast. U-boats were small. Even with radar, luck played a role. But the crews were patient. They knew U-boats had to surface. They knew the hunting grounds. They knew the statistics were about to change. On the night of June 9th, Flying Officer Wiley Howell was piloting Wellington DV-998 on patrol west of the Bay of Biscay. His radar operator was Sergeant Eric Thompson. The light operator was Sergeant James MacDonald. They had been airborne for 5 hours, crisscrossing their assigned sector at 2,000 feet altitude. The sea below was invisible, a void of perfect darkness. At 23:38 hours, Thompson called out a contact, bearing 270, range 8 miles. Howell turned toward it, beginning a gradual descent. The contact was solid, not sea clutter. It held steady, a surfaced vessel, moving slowly, probably a U-boat charging batteries. Howell felt his pulse accelerate. This was what they had trained for. The aircraft closed at 160 miles per hour. 7 miles, 6 miles, 5 miles. The radar contact grew stronger. Thompson called continuous updates, bearing now 265, range 4 miles. Howell descended to 600 feet. He reduced speed slightly to improve control. His hands were steady on the controls, but his mind raced through the sequence. Light on at 1,000 yards. Confirm target. Steady the approach. Release at 300 yards. 3 miles. 2 miles. Still the U-boat showed no sign of alarm, no diving, no evasive action. They were oblivious. 1 mile. Howell's thumb hovered over the light switch. MacDonald had the searchlight armed and aimed. 800 yards. 700. Now. The night exploded into day. Oberleutnant von Rosenstiel's first indication of danger was the light. Not a gradual brightening, not a distant glow. An instantaneous detonation of white brilliance that turned the ocean surface into a mirror and the U-boat into a stage performer caught in a spotlight. For one frozen second, his brain could not process what was happening. Where there had been darkness, there was now searing light. Where there had been safety, there was now absolute exposure. His eyes, adapted to night vision, were instantly blinded. He could see nothing but white glare, and the after-image of his own shadow burned onto his retinas. The lookouts screamed warnings that were already obsolete. Aircraft, diving, alarm. But von Rosenstiel knew with sickening certainty that there was no time. From the position of the light, the aircraft was already overhead, already attacking. The standard 40-second crash dive might as well have been 40 minutes. He shouted the orders anyway, because training demanded it, because doing nothing was unacceptable. Alarm! Dive! Dive! Below him, the bridge watch scrambled for the hatch. The diesel engines shut down with a mechanical scream as their air supply was cut. The electric motors engaged, the dive planes angled down. But the boat was responding in slow motion, her buoyancy fighting the order to submerge. Above, Howell saw his target perfectly illuminated, the long grey hull, the conning tower with its emblem. Figures on the bridge moving with desperate urgency. He steadied his approach, fighting the instinct to rush. The aircraft dropped through 500 feet. 400. The U-boat's deck was awash now, water beginning to cover her. But she was still there, still solid, still a target. At 300 yards, Howell pressed the release. 6 depth charges tumbled from the Wellington's bomb bay, spaced 50 feet apart in a stick that would straddle the submarine's length. Each charge weighed 400 pounds. Each contained 290 pounds of Torpex explosive, more powerful than TNT. They were set to detonate at 25 feet depth. Von Rosenstiel felt the boat angle downward. The bridge hatch clanged shut above him as the last lookout dropped through. Water was already pouring over the foredeck. The conning tower was a tower no longer but an island shrinking in a rising flood. He grabbed the ladder to descend into the pressure hull when the world ended. The first depth charge detonated 30 feet from the U-boat's stern, slightly below her keel. The shock wave was a physical blow that lifted the entire stern several feet, bending the pressure hull, rupturing seams, cracking welds. The second charge exploded alongside the control room, 20 feet to port. The pressure hull, designed to withstand sea pressure, was never meant to resist explosions from outside. A section of plating buckled inward, rivets sheared. The third charge detonated directly beneath the bow torpedo room. Men inside died instantly, their bodies pulverized by the pressure wave transmitted through water. The forward compartment flooded in seconds through ruptures too large to contain. The fourth, fifth, and sixth charges detonated in sequence, each adding to the accumulated damage. Inside the control room, chaos was absolute. Lights failed. Men were thrown against machinery. The chief engineer, still at his station, watched the depth gauge needle swing past 20 meters, 30, 40, accelerating. The boat was no longer diving, under control. She was falling, flooded, her buoyancy destroyed. Compressed air roared from ruptured tanks. Seawater jetted through a dozen breaches. The plainsmen tried desperately to level her, but the dive planes were unresponsive, their hydraulics failed. Von Rosenstiel, thrown down the ladder by the first explosion, tried to reach the control room. Water was ankle-deep and rising. The boat's angle was past 30 degrees nose down. He could hear the screaming of tearing metal, the thunder of flooding, the cries of injured men. He knew they were dead, all of them. There would be no escape from this depth, no miracle. The pressure hull would fail long before they reached crush depth. They were entombed. U-502 reached 150 meters depth when her pressure hull finally collapsed. The implosion was mercifully quick. The hull folded inward in multiple places simultaneously, the sea pressure finding every weakness created by the depth charges. Water at that depth, compressed by 150 tons per square meter, rushed inward faster than sound. The 44 men aboard died without time to comprehend their death. The boat continued downward, a broken cylinder tumbling toward the abyssal floor 3,000 meters below. Above, Howell circled once. The Leigh Light was off now. The darkness returned. His radar showed no contact. The sea was empty. Where a U-boat had been charging peacefully, there was now only disturbed water and spreading oil. He noted the position, the time, the sequence of events. Then he turned for home, his crew silent with the realization of what they had accomplished. They had killed. Efficiently. Clinically. In less than 30 seconds from light on to impact. Back at Chivanor, the debriefing confirmed a kill. The evidence was solid. Radar contact. Visual confirmation. Proper attack sequence. Oil slick observed. No surfacing. U-502 would be listed as overdue, then missing, then presumed lost with all hands. Her families would receive telegrams expressing regret. Her commander's name would join the growing list of U-boat men who simply vanished into the Atlantic. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the larger significance was just beginning to emerge. The Leigh Light had achieved what 2 years of night patrols had failed to accomplish. It had made darkness lethal for U-boats. The weapon system worked, the tactics were sound, the training was adequate. Now it was time to expand. Number 17. 2 squadrons' success triggered an urgent program. More Wellingtons were fitted with Leigh Lights, more crews were trained, more patrols were launched, and the U-boats, still operating under the old assumptions, continued to surface at night to charge their batteries. The German Naval High Command first learned something had changed when U-boats began disappearing in the Bay of Biscay at an alarming rate. June 1942 saw 3 boats lost in that transit area. July saw 5 more. August another 4. These were not losses to convoy escorts or known patrol areas. These were boats simply vanishing during what should have been safe passages. Some radioed brief contact reports, under air attack, taking damage, diving, then silence. Others transmitted nothing at all, simply failing to arrive at their patrol areas or return to base. The pattern was unmistakable to analysts at Kriegsmarine headquarters. Something new was killing U-boats at night. Intelligence officers interrogated survivors from damaged boats that managed to limp home. The reports were consistent and disturbing. Aircraft were attacking at night with no warning. One moment darkness, the next moment brilliant light and falling bombs. The attacks came too quickly to dive. The light was blinding, disorienting. Some survivors spoke of being unable to see for minutes after the light extinguished, their night vision destroyed. One commander described it as being hit by a physical blow, the light so intense it felt solid. Another said his entire bridge crew had been temporarily blinded, stumbling into each other in panic as they tried to reach the hatch. Admiral Dönitz read these reports with growing alarm. His entire operational doctrine was based on surface mobility and night safety. If U-boats could not surface safely at night, they could not recharge batteries. If they could not recharge, they could not patrol effectively. The submarines would be reduced to slow underwater vehicles with minimal range and endurance. The mathematics of the Atlantic campaign would shift dramatically against Germany. He convened meetings with technical experts. What was this light? How did aircraft find U-boats in complete darkness? Was it a new type of radar? Some kind of infrared detection? How could it be countered? The answers came slowly, pieced together from survivor accounts and from signals intelligence. The British had developed a powerful searchlight coupled with improved radar. The system allowed aircraft to approach in darkness, then illuminate targets at close range. There was no electronic warning, no time to dive. The light itself was merely a searchlight, not a death ray or exotic weapon, but its tactical application was revolutionary. Dönitz's staff calculated the new probabilities. With the Leigh Light, British aircraft effectiveness at night had increased by an order of magnitude. Boats that surfaced to charge now faced roughly a 1 in 10 chance of being caught by a patrol aircraft in high-traffic areas like the Bay of Biscay. Those were unacceptable odds. Countermeasures were debated. Some officers suggested U-boats should stay surfaced and fight back with anti-aircraft guns. The theory was sound. An aircraft illuminating itself with a searchlight was also exposing itself to defensive fire. If the U-boat crew could overcome their blindness quickly enough, they might shoot down the attacker. This doctrine was implemented in late summer, 1942. U-boats were fitted with additional anti-aircraft weapons. Crews were trained to man the guns immediately when illuminated rather than diving. The results were mixed at best. Some aircraft were damaged, one was shot down, but many more U-boats were sunk while trying to fight on the surface. The Leigh Light gave attacking aircraft too much advantage. By the time U-boat gunners could see through the glare and return fire, the depth charges were already falling. Other countermeasures included painting U-boats in darker colors to reduce visibility. Some boats experimented with rubber coatings to absorb radar waves, though this proved largely ineffective against centimetric radar. A few commanders tried sailing fully submerged through high-risk areas, but this reduced their operational range so severely it defeated the purpose of the patrol. The most successful countermeasure was simply avoiding predictable patterns, varying the times of surfacing, charging batteries in multiple short sessions rather than one long session, posting extra lookouts with specific responsibility to watch the sky. But these were tactical adaptations, not solutions. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. The night, which had been their sanctuary, was now a hunting ground where they were prey. Men who had once surfaced with relief now did so with dread. Every minute on the surface felt exposed. Every hour of charging was an hour of vulnerability. Lookouts stared into the darkness until their eyes ached, knowing that the first sign of danger would be blinding light at point-blank range. Some crews requested transfers, others developed stress-related conditions. The confident, aggressive spirit of the early war years was eroding under the constant pressure of technological surprise. By autumn 1942, the Leigh Light's impact was statistically undeniable. In the 6 months from June through November, Coastal Command sank 22 U-boats at night, compared to perhaps 6 in all of 1941. The kill rate had increased nearly fourfold. More significantly, the psychological warfare was working. U-boats were spending less time on the surface. Their batteries were chronically undercharged. Their operational range decreased. Their effectiveness declined. Convoys that might have been attacked were instead bypassed because the U-boats lacked sufficient battery power to pursue. The tonnage of Allied shipping sunk began to plateau, then decline. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany had been winning through 1942, was shifting towards stalemate. Admiral Dönitz continued to send boats into the Atlantic, but now with a burden of knowledge that darkened every patrol. His submarines were no longer invisible hunters in the night. They were targets, vulnerable, mortal. The darkness that had protected them had been pierced by human ingenuity and 24 million candle power of Searchlight. The foundation of U-boat doctrine had cracked, and every commander who surfaced to charge his batteries knew that somewhere in the black sky above, an aircraft might be approaching, silently, invisibly, carrying the light that turned night into day and hunters into hunted. The winter of 1942 into 1943 marked a fundamental shift in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the Leigh Light was central to that transformation. By December 1942, Coastal Command had equipped 5 full squadrons with the system. Number 172 Squadron was joined by numbers 179, 172, 406, and others. The coverage expanded from the Bay of Biscay to the western approaches, the North Atlantic convoy routes, and even the Arctic passages. Anywhere U-boats operated, Leigh Light aircraft now hunted. The numbers told a story that German naval intelligence could not ignore. In 1941, before the Leigh Light, the entire RAF Coastal Command sank 9 U-boats total, most during daylight. In 1942, after the Leigh Light's introduction in June, that number jumped to 37. In 1943, it would reach 85. The technology had not merely improved British capabilities, it had revolutionized them. More than the raw kill numbers, the operational impact was devastating. U-boats now spent significantly less time on the surface. A boat that once might surface for 6 hours nightly to fully charge batteries now surfaced for 90-minute intervals, diving at any suspicious sound or radar contact. This chronic undercharging of batteries reduced submerged endurance, which reduced time available to track and attack convoys. Patrols became shorter, the operational radius from French bases shrank. U-boats that once ranged as far as the American coast were now confined to closer waters. The tonnage war that Dönitz had been winning suddenly stalled. In November 1942, U-boats sank 119 Allied ships. By March 1943, that number had dropped to 63. It would continue declining. The calculus that Dönitz had relied on, sink ships faster than they can be built, no longer held. American shipyards were now producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. British yards were turning out escorts at an accelerating pace. The Allies were winning the production war, and the Leigh Light was ensuring they could deliver those ships safely. The human cost on the German side was staggering. U-boat crews had always faced high casualty rates, but now those rates approached catastrophic levels. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 would die. A 75% fatality rate, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the Second World War. Many of those deaths came after the Leigh Light changed the tactical balance. Young men, some barely 20 years old, were being sent into the Atlantic, knowing the statistics, knowing that 3 out of 4 of them would not return. Yet they went because duty demanded it, because propaganda insisted Germany was still winning, because refusing meant disgrace or worse. The crews who survived Leigh Light attacks often suffered lasting trauma. The sudden transition from darkness to blinding light, the helplessness as depth charges fell, the screams of drowning comrades, these memories haunted survivors for decades. Some could not sleep without lights on. Others developed a pathological fear of enclosed spaces, ironic for men who had volunteered for submarine service. Post-war interviews with U-boat veterans consistently highlighted the Leigh Light as the moment when they realized the war was lost. One commander, Kapitänleutnant Herbert Werner, who survived the war, wrote in his memoir that after experiencing his first Leigh Light attack, he knew with certainty that Germany could not win. The technology gap was too great. The Allies were adapting faster. The darkness that had been the U-boat's greatest advantage was gone. For the British, the Leigh Light represented more than a tactical success. It was validation of a strategic approach to warfare. Invest in technology. Empower individual officers to innovate, test rapidly, deploy quickly. Squadron leader Leigh himself received recognition for his contribution. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and later the Order of the British Empire. But he remained a modest man, deflecting credit to the engineers, the crews, the broader Coastal Command organization. In his later writings, he emphasized that the Leigh Light was merely one tool in a comprehensive anti-submarine system that included improved radar, better depth charges, enhanced sonar, longer-range aircraft, and most critically, ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park that allowed convoys to route around known U-boat concentrations. The technology itself continued to evolve. By 1943, some aircraft were fitted with even more powerful lights. Others experimented with multiple lights to eliminate shadows. Infrared searchlights were tested to illuminate targets without blinding the aircrew, though these proved less effective than visible spectrum lights. The basic principle, however, remained unchanged. Find the target with radar, approach in darkness, illuminate at close range, attack immediately. It was simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective. By mid-1943, Admiral Dönitz effectively conceded the night surface battle. He ordered U-boats to remain submerged as much as possible, even if it meant severely reduced effectiveness. The age of the surface-attacking submarine was over. The future belonged to true submarines, boats that could remain submerged for their entire patrol, breathing through snorkels or eventually not needing to breathe at all. Germany would develop such boats late in the war, the Type 21 electro-boats, but too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Leigh Light's influence extended far beyond its immediate tactical success. It represented a fundamental principle in modern warfare that became doctrine in all subsequent conflicts. Technological surprise can neutralize numerical or positional advantage. The U-boat force in 1942 was large, experienced, and operationally successful. Yet a single innovation, deployed across a relatively small number of aircraft, negated years of German tactical development. This lesson was studied intensely by post-war military theorists. The Americans applied it in the Pacific, developing night-fighting capabilities for carrier aircraft. The Soviets studied it while building their Cold War submarine fleet. The specific technology of the Leigh Light became obsolete within years. By the late 1940s, radar had improved to the point where visual illumination was unnecessary. Airborne searchlights were removed from patrol aircraft, replaced by more sophisticated sensors. But the operational concept survived and evolved. Modern maritime patrol aircraft use radar, infrared sensors, magnetic anomaly detectors, and sonobuoys to find submarines. Once found, the target is attacked with homing torpedoes or depth charges, far more sophisticated than those of the Second World War. Yet the fundamental sequence, detect, close, illuminate, strike, remains essentially unchanged from Squadron Leader Leigh's original concept. The psychological warfare aspect of the Leigh Light also left a lasting legacy. Modern military doctrine recognizes that destroying enemy morale and confidence can be as important as destroying enemy equipment. The Leigh Light achieved both. It killed U-boats, and it killed the U-boat crew's sense of invulnerability. This dual impact, material and psychological, became a model for future weapons development. The goal was not merely to be effective, but to be terrifyingly, unpredictably effective. To make the enemy fear engaging, to force them into defensive postures that reduced their operational capability. In Germany, the Leigh Light experience contributed to a broader realization that the war was technologically lost. By 1943, German scientists and engineers understood they were being outpaced in multiple domains: radar, sonar, code breaking, production capacity, logistics. The myth of German technical superiority, so central to Nazi ideology, was collapsing under the weight of evidence. U-boat crews returning from patrol brought stories not just of the Leigh Light, but of increasingly sophisticated convoy defenses, of escort carriers providing air cover in mid-ocean, of destroyer groups that could track submarines with frightening accuracy. Each technological surprise compounded the sense that Germany was fighting a losing battle against an enemy with superior resources and innovation. For the Allies, the success validated their approach to combined operations. The Leigh Light worked because it was part of a system: Coastal Command aircraft, Royal Navy escorts, merchant convoys, intelligence services, all worked in coordination. No single element would have succeeded alone, but together they created a network of capabilities that strangled the U-boat threat. This systems approach became foundational to NATO doctrine during the Cold War. Anti-submarine warfare would remain a combined effort, integrating air, surface, and subsurface assets with intelligence and logistics support. The men who flew Leigh Light aircraft in 1942 and 43 were mostly forgotten after the war. Few became famous. No movies celebrated their achievements. Yet their contribution to Allied victory was substantial. They flew endless patrols over empty ocean in all weather. They spent hours in cramped aircraft, cold and tired, staring at radar screens. When they found targets, they faced anti-aircraft fire and the very real possibility of being shot down. Some were killed, some were captured after ditching in the Atlantic. Most simply survived, returned home, and resumed civilian lives without fanfare. In interviews conducted decades later, many expressed ambivalence about their role. They had killed, often young men like themselves who were simply following orders. They understood the necessity, but they did not celebrate it. One pilot, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled his first Leigh Light kill. He described seeing the U-boat crew on the bridge in that instant of illumination. "They were boys," he said. "Just boys in grey uniforms, looking up with terror on their faces." He had pressed the release, the depth charges had fallen, and those boys had died. He did not regret the action. The U-boat would have killed merchant sailors if allowed to continue, but he did not forget those faces either. War, he reflected, was necessary evil. Evil part did not disappear just because the necessity was real. This moral complexity, rarely discussed during the war itself, became a common theme in post-war reflections. The Leigh Light had been a good weapon used in a just cause. It had helped win the war, but its use had required men to kill other men efficiently and repeatedly. The psychological cost of that efficiency was carried silently by those who had borne it. The technology files related to the Leigh Light were declassified in the 1970s. Researchers studying them were struck by how simple the core concept was. A searchlight, radar, basic coordination, nothing exotic, nothing that required breakthrough science. The genius was in recognizing the tactical problem and applying existing technology in a novel way. This became a case study in innovation. Sometimes the most effective solutions are not the most complex. Sometimes victory comes not from inventing new tools, but from using old tools in new ways. The Leigh Light was a searchlight, a device that had existed for decades. But mounted on an aircraft and coupled with radar, it became a war-winning weapon. On the night of June 9, 1942, Oberleutnant von Rosenstiel stood in darkness, believing himself safe. That belief, shared by hundreds of U-boat commanders, was rooted in 2 years of operational experience and statistical evidence. The night protected submarines. Aircraft could not find them. This was known, this was proven, this was doctrine. 90 seconds later, von Rosenstiel was dead, his boat broken and sinking, his crew drowning in the dark Atlantic. The certainty that had governed his tactical decisions had been instantly, violently falsified. He had no time to process this new reality, no time to adapt, no time to warn others. The light came and death followed too quickly for understanding. This is the essential tragedy of the Leigh Light story. Not that men died, though that is tragic enough, but that they died still believing in safety that no longer existed. U-boat crews continued surfacing at night for months after the Leigh Light was introduced, because information spread slowly, because headquarters was slow to change doctrine, because individual commanders trusted their own experience over abstract warnings. Each boat that surfaced in darkness after June 1942 was gambling on odds that had fundamentally changed without their knowledge. Some won the gamble and survived, most lost and died. The gap between reality and perception killed as surely as the depth charges. This gap is a recurring theme in military history. Technology changes, tactics evolve, but human understanding lags behind. Soldiers fight with doctrines developed for previous wars. Commanders make decisions based on outdated intelligence. By the time the organization adapts, hundreds or thousands have died learning lessons that could have been taught in advance. The U-boat force paid in blood for an education it received one boat at a time. Each loss added data. Each survivor's report added understanding. But the learning curve was written in dead sailors. By the time German Naval Command fully grasped the Leigh Light threat and issued comprehensive countermeasures, it was late 1942. 6 months and dozens of boats had been lost. The Atlantic balance had shifted. The war had moved past the point where U-boats could be decisive. For the families of U-boat men, the losses were particularly cruel. Many never knew how their sons, husbands, or fathers had died. U-boats that failed to return were listed as missing, then presumed lost. The official notifications gave no details. Lost in action was all the information provided. Whether the boat had been sunk by escorts, aircraft, mines, or accident remained unknown. Whether death had been quick or agonizingly slow, whether men had escaped the sinking boat only to drown in the cold Atlantic, these questions haunted families for years. Some held hope that their loved ones were prisoners, not casualties. Only after the war, when records were compared and survivor testimony collected, did the full accounting become possible. The British crews who operated the Leigh Lights lived with their own burdens. They were the instruments of death, efficient and impersonal. They found targets on radar screens, pressed switches to ignite lights, released levers to drop charges. The men they killed were usually invisible, just a U-boat shape briefly illuminated before disappearing beneath explosions and spray. This distance made the killing easier in the moment but sometimes harder in memory. One navigator, writing decades later, described recurring dreams of that brilliant light cutting through darkness, revealing not a submarine but a ship full of drowning men reaching upward. He understood intellectually that his actions had been necessary, that the U-boats were legitimate military targets, that killing them had saved Allied sailors. But understanding did not erase the dreams. The larger lesson of the Leigh Light extends beyond military technology. It speaks to the fragility of certainty. Von Rosenstiel's confidence in the safety of darkness was not irrational. It was based on solid evidence and extensive experience. Yet it was wrong, invalidated overnight by innovation he did not know existed. This is the human condition in times of rapid change. What we know, what we trust, what we build our decisions upon, can be rendered obsolete by forces beyond our awareness. The pace of change in warfare during the Second World War was extraordinary. Technologies that took decades to develop in peacetime were deployed in months during the war. Tactics that had governed naval combat for generations were overturned in single battles. The men who fought in that environment operated in constant uncertainty, knowing that any day might bring some new weapon, some new doctrine, some new reality that would invalidate everything they thought they knew. In this sense, Every U-boat crew that surfaced to charge batteries after June 1942 was an example of human vulnerability in the face of technological change. They did what they had always done, what they had been trained to do, what their experience told them was safe, and they died because the world had changed in ways they could not see. The light that revealed them in their final moments was both literal and metaphorical. It illuminated not just their physical presence, but the obsolescence of their doctrine, the failure of their assumptions, the fatal gap between what they believed and what was true. That gap, measured in the 90 seconds between light and death, was the distance between the old war and the new, between surface raiders and true submarines, between human instinct and technological reality. Admiral Dönitz, in his post-war writings, identified the Leigh Light as one of the key factors that defeated the U-boat campaign. Not the only factor, he was careful to note. Allied production, code breaking, improved escort tactics, long-range aircraft, all contributed. But the Leigh Light was the innovation that made night operations untenable, that forced U-boats to remain submerged, that reduced their effectiveness to the point where they could no longer threaten Allied logistics. It was, he concluded, a small device with strategic consequences. 24 million candlepower of light had helped illuminate the path to Allied victory and German defeat. The men who died in that light, on both sides, were casualties of progress. The technology that killed them represented human ingenuity applied to the problem of industrial war. That same ingenuity would eventually create weapons so terrible that war itself would become unthinkable between major powers. But in 1942, in the Atlantic darkness, the lesson was simpler and more immediate. Adapt or die, innovate or lose. The light turns on without a warning, and those caught unprepared pay the ultimate price. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.